and on long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, among others. Sorry, there's lots of acronyms, so I'm going to go slow. Parties will work towards enabling action with the new collective quantified goal, NCQG, and other means of implementation. And there's hope to advance also loss and damage through fully operationalizing both the Loss and Damage Fund and the Santiago Network. And there's the COP29 presidency agenda, which will also include a thematic day on peace, relief, recovery, and recovery on the 15th of November. So why is this important to us as humanitarian actors? So commitment number 5 of the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations encourages humanitarian organizations to work collectively and collaboratively across the humanitarian sector and beyond to strengthen climate and environment action. And commitment number 6 of the Charter calls on organizations to use our influence to mobilize urgent and more ambitious climate action and environmental protection. So the COP29 offers us an amazing opportunity for actors across the humanitarian, climate, environment, and peace building and other sectors to come together and advocate for ambitious and concrete action. And we heard from you signatories during the survey we conducted in June this year, the opportunity for us to engage in COP. And this is why through this webinar, we hope to raise awareness among Charter signatories and the wider humanitarian sector on the variety of initiatives that are taking place at COP29. And we will also focus on our collective strengths and roles, including opportunities in advocating for and bringing solutions to the climate and environment crisis across the sectors. Hence, this topic that cuts across not just the humanitarian, but the peace building, climate, environment, and humanitarian actors that we're bringing together. Over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Nishani. And yes, as you mentioned, we heard from our signatories that COP is one of these areas where they would like the Secretariat to engage in this year, hence the webinar. And we understand that COP isn't always the easiest to figure out and navigate and try to understand how we want to engage. So before we jump into our speakers, we wanted to talk about this a bit more practically and open it up to you. So this next Menti question is, what are the challenges you or your organization is facing in engaging on COP29? And we see the 2 big responses coming in so far. You can use the Menti code at the top to log in and add your thoughts. Politics, cost, capacity, overview. I'm curious if that means understanding an overview of what the agenda is or how to engage, the number of badges, crowded space. There's too many events. Absolutely. That's what COP is often all about. Many, many events. It's a really important opportunity for everyone to come together, of course. And it also means that there's a lot to do. Overview of activities, other priorities, of course. So many interesting responses coming in. Peace is not an agenda. Meaningful contribution. Right, I think this is a big one. You know, we of course want to find our ways to contribute, especially as a humanitarian sector that are working on the ground and with communities. But how do we do so meaningfully, and where do we do so meaningfully? And I think with that, maybe I'll actually pass it back to Nishani to introduce our speakers, who may have a bit also of an insight now into what you're, as signatories in the room, are thinking about your challenges in figuring out how to engage at COP this year. Back to you, Nishani.
Thanks, Natasha, and thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts. Very interesting stuff coming through. And to the speakers, I mean, we have an amazing array of speakers today, and no pressure, guys. You can address all the challenges that's coming up on the Mentimeter right now, I'm sure. So Just getting on to our speakers, we've got Climate Action Network International, PAN International set of political strategies, Jacopo Oceran, sharing perspectives from the climate and environment sector. And from the peace building sector, we've got Harriet McHale-Hill, the Climate and Peace Advisor at International Alert and co-chair of COP Policy Group and the Environment, Climate, Conflict and Peace ECCP Community of Practice. We've also got no introduction necessary for many humanitarians here, but Kirsten Hagen, Policy and Diplomacy Team Lead of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC, and she's also the co-chair of the Interagency Standing Committee Subgroup on Climate, bringing us insights from the humanitarian sector. And we've got Alice Baya, who's Policy Advisor of Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, and she's the coordinator of the Advisory Group on Climate Change and Human Mobility, who'll be sharing with us some opportunities to discuss human mobility and loss and damage at COP29. So without further ado, let's look at Jacopo, CAN International has been extremely engaged in the COPs and in the climate and environment space and sphere. As you heard from the challenges, the COP process is extremely complicated. It's a big piece that we humanitarians are trying to get our head around all the time. So would you be able to share with us what are some of the key priorities and milestones leading towards and during at the COP basically and after the COP, and what are some of the challenges that you see from the climate perspective and other perspectives, and opportunities for observers like NGOs, civil society, think tanks, academics to engage at COP29? No big questions, but you know, simple ones. Over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Nisha, and hi to everybody. Thanks a lot for the invitation in the first place. Before I introduce myself and I speak a little bit about CAN and COPs, and I try to answer to the questions. Let me start off saying, let me start by saying that you know, while we are having this conversation today, the escalation on the Middle East war, as we all know, is exceeding all limits, and we are facing probably a regional war, and this is a critical issue of human rights. And I'm saying this now, first of all, not just to go with business as usual, because this is no business as usual, but also for take it as the frame that we should. All work that we do at CAN International, and I will be talking about the network, is under the understanding on what we call climate justice. And there is no climate justice without human rights, and there is no human rights without climate justice. Okay, so I think it's very important that we just take the thinking, and also, and probably this goes to the first point on what is the merge of the humanitarian community, and if we can call it the climate justice community. Obviously, what it put us together is the human rights, okay, and the defense of them. So I think that's very important that we always take this as I would say, as a pillar and as a starting point of our discussion and our thinking. Myself, I have a bit of a background on humanitarian. Well, more than a bit. I've been working for over 1 decade on humanitarian work, mostly in Africa, mostly with Oxfam. Okay, so and I've been moving on later on resilience and disaster risk reduction, and to end up in the last decade on climate justice. CAN International, just to make it in a brief, we are on the UN UNFCCC system, on the UN Agency for Climate Justice, in the process that the UNFCCC is running. As in many other things with UNC processes, there are several constituencies, and one of them is the environmental NGOs, and CAN is the network, is one of the two networks actually that is holding and that is trying to support and put together the demands of over 1,700 NGOs of all sizes, as you can imagine. So our main role is basically to put together a network, to influence into the process, inform, to learn, to push together and to do this work all together. And one last caveat, as I as I saw the Menti and I saw, the question on how to engage and how difficult it is to engage. Of course, I know that the topic today is about COP29, but I'm going to be saying something that obviously most of you know, but just let's think that on the climate negotiations and on the climate politics, COPs is just a piece of it, okay? And actually it's a converging point that happens every year, but it's not the only at all. Actually, there is a lot of preparation into COPs, and also there is a lot of after COP work that is sent to countries and to regions. Okay, so you already mentioned it. The national adaptation plans. This is something where countries and NGOs can and should be influencing. It is much more important a national adaptation plan, let's say, of Mozambique, that actually a resolution that is talking about adaptation globally, because actually we need to go to the practical grounding. So there is a lot to do. I know that today we are talking about COP, but I think it's important that in this commitment 6 and 7 that we have in the charter, we think that is plenty of space. Going to COP29. COP29, so 28 before, and this is counting from Rio, okay, and more to go, because next year it will be in Brazil and going on. Okay, COPs are a conference of parties, and basically is where all the signatories of the different agreements, Rio, Kyoto, and Paris, meet. So almost every member state, and they just work on the different commitments, in the different accountabilities, in the, that they have took over these agreements, and they show how they are implementing, and the identification of the need to scale on different fronts, etc. This year, COP is about finance, okay, and this is important because we have the acronym, the NCQG, the quantified. I can remember. Well, I just plugged that. The NCQG, I say so many, the quantified goal. Okay, so I think it is important that we take into account, and for those that are a little bit familiar with the process, there was an agreement in Paris, okay, that countries, rich countries, developed countries, so-called developed countries, they took the commitment to disburse 100 billion a year to fight the climate change in impoverished countries, in poorer countries. Actually, this was an agreement on 2015, and to be put into place in 2020. Okay, I would say to reach the 100 billion by 2020. And it was said also in Paris that in 2025, this quantified goal, the figure, was to be revised. Okay, and this is what this COP is about, and where the fight is, and I would say the key milestone. Within that, and I think it's particularly important, I start with for the humanitarians, it is all the issue of loss and damage. I think you were mentioning well, Natasha, 2 years ago in COP27, it was agreed to loss and damage. It was a win, I would say, of civil society to recognize, to bring in the agreement that rich countries were taking the responsibility of compensating poor countries for the damage that they are doing with the climate crisis, and it was the agreement to put in place a loss and damage fund. Almost 2 years later, we are almost there, in the sense that the loss and damage fund is being established. Now it has a president, is being temporarily held under the World Bank. And now what is important is, and this is part of the fight this year, is to decide how much money is going to be in the fund. Okay, and this is crucial, that obviously, we just bring and we are able to push in the direction that the amount needs to be serious, and well, there is different calculations. The governing body is suggesting at this point 661 million a year, million US. We consider that, civil society and ministry organization, we consider that this is quite short. Okay, but in any case, we are talking about money and about quality of demand. Okay, so I think it's quite important that we include there. Now zooming out, not just on loss and damage, on the new collective and quantified goal. Okay, what is important is that, of course, the total amount is, I will say, sensibly bigger than 100 billion, but also that it is clearly identified, and this was not in the initial goal in Paris. Okay, it's clearly identified what we call the sub-goals or the different envelopes. And loss and damage, we are claiming to make it one of them. So what we are saying is, let's not have a separate loss and damage envelope. Okay, no, let's go for a collective quantified goal, and let's talk about how much needs to go for adaptation. Let's talk about how much needs to go for mitigation, and let's talk about how much needs to go for loss and damage. Okay, so this is quite important that we. Okay, so the sub goals of the different envelopes within the big one is an important fight and something that we hope to win. Why not in this COP? Another important element is what we say, the money needs to be in grants and no loans, and it needs to be, I mean, the money identified needs to be clearly identified as money, public money that is going, okay, from rich governments to poor governments, and not to making the count, I don't know, private sector investment. Okay, this can be additional and very much welcome, but on the counting, it needs to be clearly identified as grant. Okay, and then of course we bring all the thinking about what we call the quality of the money. I just made short the long story. I say there was a commitment of 100 billion from Paris to be met in 2020. Let me tell you that by 2024, that has not been met already. And there is different counting. This is one thing that is important. So there is different counting because there's no clarity what is climate finance. But on top of it, there is also clearly, even in the more optimistic one, it says that by 2024, 2023, the last count, the 100 billion were not reached. Okay, so imagine, okay, the importance of being sure that the new amount that we talk about, that we include quality and accountability elements to be sure that they are in there. Okay, so then of course we are talking about money that is, is the elements of equity, differentiation, and just listen on this because I'm going to be, I mean, this is something that I know that it sounds very familiar to the humanitarian sector, no? So predictability, additionality, so it needs to be, okay, so clearly all these key elements on the money need to be included, okay? So going to the question, how well, I would say this is mostly on the agenda, okay? And there is other key elements or important elements on the agenda, and we were already mention it, but clearly it is first of all, as we say, the adaptation, what they call it the adaptation work plan, but basically it's the increase and the update on what are the adaptation objectives, and also what are the adaptation funding. Okay, on the read of however these 100 billion were spent, clearly adaptation is much shorter than what is on mitigation. And we all know in the humanitarian sector the importance of adaptations, the importance of resilience building, the importance of being loss and damage, something to compensate for the disaster that already has happened, but also being adaptation, the set of actions that we do to avoid that the disaster is much bigger. Okay, so the importance of that on the resilience building on a serious plan, on a serious way that the countries are presenting national adaptation plans is crucial, okay, and then the money for it. So just to finish, where the humanitarian sector on how can help. To me, there is two key elements, and this I'm going back to the times where I was working more focused on the humanitarian, one of them, which is around the funding. I remember back 10 years ago, when the principles of good humanitarian donorships, I don't know if you remember that one, but the 24 principles of good humanitarian donorship, and I went on preparing this intervention, I went back into them, and when I was reading them, they are so similar to the what we are talking about for funding under the NCQG. Of course, the amounts are different, but the predictability, the importance, making it additional, making it, the governance of it. There is plenty of elements that they've been on the discussion on humanitarian funding that they are totally accurate and needed, okay, for the discussions on the climate finance. And I think that this is important, that the know-how, the experience, the things that have worked and have not worked in the past, I think this is quite important. And the second key element, what I know that is important and is key on the humanitarian agenda, which is localization. Okay, the localization agenda is so crucial in the humanitarian sector as it is on the on the climate action. Okay, so climate justice, one of the key elements that needs to bring is to come with a decolonizing agenda. Okay, and an agenda where people that is suffering the most of the climate crisis is able to take the decisions and is in the decision making. And I know that a lot of that is in the localization agenda. I know that obviously, as with the humanitarian donorship, the localization agenda, it has its difficulties. But this is what I'm referring, and it has also its successes. So this is what I'm referring to when we are talking about how can we bring together, or how can the humanitarian sector can jump with experience into the climate justice negotiation. I think is something that experience and that know-how is something that needs to be integrated. And to be honest, myself, that I have done the journey from more humanitarian to climate justice, I see that it's missing. Okay, so we can really take advantage of that. I will stop here because I think I went over time. But in any case, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this moment.
Thanks, Jacobo. I mean, I think it's good you really helped us to kind of pick up some of those key spaces that you talked about, the National Adaptation Plan, where actually on the ground, civil society, NGOs, organizations that are working at country level can really provide input to and influence. We talked about influence, then also the principles that the humanitarians talk about in terms of our funding, our financing, but at the same time, the localization aspect, they're all very similar to what the climate financing, climate justice speaks about. So I think it's just that we use different terminology. It's just we're speaking similar languages because we also talk about how do we get as close to communities as possible, access to funding as close as possible to communities. So please do share your questions to Jacobo on the chat. We will come back to Q&A with some of these, very targeted. In the space of the fact that we are mindful of timing, let's go to Harriet. Harriet, you are looking at, you're part of the COP policy group with the Environment, Climate, Conflict, and Peace Community of Practice. So this is where the peace comes into play. What are some of these key initiatives that the peace building community is engaged in to raise awareness on the intersections of conflict, peace, climate, which seems to be quite high on the agenda of the COP presidency anyway? Where does it fit in also maybe perhaps with the typical COP processes? But what are kind of the steps that we as a humanitarian, next steps to take forward the declaration that we signed on last year? The COP28 had the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace. Where are some of these next steps to go forward, and what could you share with us today on the webinar with all these participants here? Thank you.
Thanks, Nish. So I'm Harriet. It's really nice to be here, and I think it's really a great time to be having this chat with COP29 around the corner. So indeed, we, as the ECCP, which is the Community of Practice on Environment, Climate, Conflict and Peace, which is quite a mouthful. So who are we? So it's a kind of a community that was created back in 2020, and it moved very much from being a Geneva-based community to expand throughout Europe, and now is very much it very much spans the globe. We have participants that represent all the way from grassroots organizations up to state representatives, including academics and youth, for example. So a very, very diverse group. Under which, so this is the big ECCP community, under which there are various working groups, and one of those working groups is the peace community working on policy that we would like to direct towards the UNFCCC, and this is a group that I co-chair with Thomas Reeves from Oxfam. So let's have a look a little bit at what we're calling for, what we stand for, what are the initiatives that we want to take forward. So I think our umbrella stance and our umbrella ask is that climate and conflict are so very much linked. And we strongly believe that when engaging in a conflict and fragile setting, it is necessary, absolutely necessary, to take on board a conflict-sensitive angle. So it's a very diverse group. So when we come up with a policy paper that we have, that is in the final steps of being approved, this addresses a various array of topics. So our latest policy paper, we developed one last year as well. Our latest one will launch next week on the 8th, alongside the Berlin Climate Security Conference. We look in there at the quality of said climate finance, looking at into direct access, for example, earmarking, grants, not loans. A lot of what Jacopo just mentioned in terms of quality is definitely mirrored there. We also look at mitigating military emissions, enhancing the role of youth, the very necessary cross-sectoral knowledge sharing, and community engagement and local ownership. Now, I've whizzed through them at a record pace. I'm happy to go into more details in questions, or I can drop my email in the chat as well. Another initiative that we've also launched is some of us didn't sign on the declaration last year, the COP28 declaration, and we very much want to do so this year, and we'll make a little bit of a media splash, where we'll also be giving some recommendations and opportunities that this declaration presents. At the end of this month, so we are in October, so the end of October, we will also be launching a conflict sensitivity paper that looks very much at, so what is conflict sensitivity all about? I think a lot of us know, but for people outside the sector, outside this little bubble, as soon as they see the word conflict, I think they get a little bit scared, and I think it sometimes goes towards, oh, a discourse on sovereignty, etc., etc. So I think, really trying to debunk what we mean about conflict sensitivity. So that'll be at the end of this month. In addition, and put together by some members of the ECCP and a group of informal donors, there is a draft of four principles for effective climate finance. And these are going to be, are at the moment being sent around to collect endorsement from governments, financial institutions, civil society, international organizations. And these can very much be seen as a follow-up to the declaration. How to give more momentum to the declaration, and I mean, why come up with another text when we already have one? And it's looking a little bit more at the how. So how can we have effective climate finance within fragile areas? And I think it's very much trying to look at a more long vision on this topic, because right now, so we had COP28 with a Peace Day, COP29 is coming with another Peace Day, and what's next? It can't just be one shot, one after the other, and maybe with no continuity. So it's really trying to work on that continuity. I'll stop there for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Harriet. And I have a follow-up question. I mean, you mentioned quite a few things that's happening. So you've got this conflict sensitivity paper, which is really important for all of us, even as humanitarians, to really understand and unpack what does that look like for us. But at the same time, you've got these draft 4 principles of effective finance, and it's really interesting to hear from Jacopo afterwards what that how those things could look like, and are they also very similar to what we mentioned, the same quality, accountability, is it predictability, equity? Are they also looking at similar principles? But the how part, and how can humanitarians engage and the sector engage? How can we take some of these initiatives to support, or how can you share some of these, and what can we do as a sector to move some of these needles forward to do the how? And that the how is really the important part. Now, when we actually had declaration to provide our support, we said, yes, we are endorsing this, but now next steps, what next? Yes, thanks.
Thanks, Nishani. And I think here, before I go in exactly to the how, I think I'd say it's really important that the humanitarian sector does engage. I think as peace builders and humanitarians, we very much work in the same contexts, for which the current system is set up to fail those very same contexts. So just for a figure, I think, so with 90% of all climate finance currently going more to middle income, high emission countries, I think there's no question about how many vulnerable communities are left out, and therefore lack the opportunity to actually build a resilient society, a resilient economy. And for the remainder of that finance, the more vulnerable you actually are, the less finance you'll actually get. So we heard from Jacopo that this year is the big year about finance. And I think this is a global opportunity to actually make sure that this finance is made more effective and more equitable. And to kind of correct the injustice and establish and mobilize climate finance in a way that supports the most vulnerable and those that receive currently the least. So I think a more coordinated approach is very necessary across sectors, and that's why. And I think this webinar is a great example of that. We definitely need to come together and have that cross-sectoral approach. And I think there are many asks that kind of mirror each other. And I think it's something you mentioned at the beginning, Nish, where you say that we're more or less saying the same stuff, but in just different language. Well, I think it's time that we decide to kind of harmonize our language and all together get behind the need for this new climate finance goal to be very ambitious. And another thing that I'd just like to mention, it's always difficult in advocacy to actually measure or see concrete impacts. But on this particular agenda, I'd just like to mention that, 3 years ago, there had never been a peace day within the UNFCCC. So COP28 represented that first ever peace day. There was a declaration that came out. There was also a mention until the penultimate version of the GST, a mention of conflict sensitivity that was then taken out. And the same, this was also introduced into the UNGA Futures Pact before being taken out. But all this just to say that there is momentum building behind this, so that if you do engage, you will start to see some kind of tangible impact of your engagement. And we can even see with international funds, climate funds, such as the GCF, that are very much engaging on this agenda too. So in terms of how you can actually engage, it's not because you're not joining the COP that you cannot participate and build momentum around COP. And as well, I think it's important to mirror what Jacopo said about this, is that COP is one event at the end of the year, but all the pieces of the puzzle are being moved forward continuously throughout the year. So in terms of all the above ECCP initiatives, we are very open for endorsement. If endorsement in itself is complicated, you can still engage online. We will be sending to our members a communication package, and I'm very happy to share that with Nish, if any of you would like to participate in that. The principles, so the 4 principles for effective climate finance are currently being circulated for endorsement, and there will be 2 online consultations held in October where you could provide some feedback on red lines. And these principles will be formally launched on the 15th of November, so which will be Peace Day. So that's another opportunity where you could give some visibility to these principles online, and make sure that for those that are not at COP, that these are still visible. And also, many of the UNFCCC events are side events are streamed online. Same for the World Leaders Summit, which is the first 2 days of the COP, whereby all head of states come forward, saying a little bit where their country stands. Some pledge, some don't, but you can watch that online. And I think, yeah, one last thing is that Peace Day is on the 15th of November. And I think that provides a great platform for visibility, for drawing visibility to this topic and asks that we may have. Thanks, Nish. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Harriet. You've given us quite a few opportunities, and I will definitely take you up on. Please do share the draft principles with us that we can also maybe share with the community. You did say there's the consultations that will be providing, which we can provide input on Redline. So that's another one, maybe if it's open to a wider group of humanitarian actors, signatories of the Charter, we'd be happy to share that also. And then obviously there's so many things that you mentioned and the coordinated approach. Yeah, this is one of the first steps. And I think this is a great segue to introduce Kirsten, and Kirsten to maybe perhaps link with some of these initiatives and things that can be done as a coordinated approach. And that's where, as the co-chair of the Interagency Standing Committee's climate subgroup, there's quite a few opportunities there as well to plug in. There's a few things going on. So maybe you can share with us a little bit of what are we as a humanitarian sector collectively working towards COP, and of course beyond the other things that, as mentioned by Harriet, there's so many options and opportunities that we can all engage. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Nishani, and hoping this is working. So hi everyone, Kirsten Hagen. I co-chair the Interagency Standing Committee Climate Change Subgroup alongside FAO and OCHA, and I think I might have seen one of my FAO colleagues on the call, so happy to see that. This group was actually set up initially in around 2019 following the Climate Action Summit by a small group of humanitarian organizations that were really keen to do more and more collectively on climate. Since then, climate change has actually become one of the priorities for the humanitarian organizations that are involved in the IASC, and it's actually been elevated to the deputies level. So that's the deputy heads of organization. And they are now responsible and have it as a standing agenda item effectively to discuss the humanitarian impacts of the climate crisis. And so we are now a subgroup of the deputies with a huge range of humanitarian organizations, and it's actually extended a little bit beyond that. So we have some quasi-humanitarian organizations, although those that are interested. We have UNDRR is there, UNEP is there as well. We also have WMO who's attending, and a number of local and national NGOs as well that are providing really critical perspectives. So a couple of things that are probably worth mentioning in terms of the different initiatives. The first thing to say is kind of the standpoint that we're coming from. And I know Jacobo mentioned some of the pieces around what he's seen as the sort of humanitarian interests and how these align with much of the climate justice community. And I think for us, the critical piece is really around what is it that we can do to address the humanitarian impacts of climate change on people. So while the UNFCCC processes are very much negotiations between states and reflect state interests, we try to bring into this conversation the people's concerns and people's needs, with the idea that anything that comes out of those negotiations, we hope will do better by the people that are most affected. And so I think that this is a really critical message that's important to us from a neutrality and impartiality perspective as well, but really trying to make a difference in terms of humanity. So in terms of what we're working on at the moment as a collective, I think it's important to see that the COP itself is not the sort of the final point. It's part of a process. And so there are a series of different UNFCCC processes that are underway, and some of which will land, finalized, be finished at this COP, some of which will not finish until the next COP or even after that. And it was actually quite interesting that there was a UNFCCC presentation and they talked about this COP as being building momentum and the next COP in Brazil as being the moment of truth. And so for some of the processes, that may well be true. So a few different processes that our membership have been working on in sort of small groups. One has been around loss and damage, which Jacobo mentioned, in particular following the discussions around what's called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, which looks at technical assistance to countries and communities in need to manage losses and damages. In addition, there's been a number of people engaging with following the conversations of the new Loss and Damage Board, because while there was an agreement to set up the fund, setting up that fund is actually quite a significant process. And so the board members are all in the process of just working out, what does this mean? You know, who will we give money to? Under what circumstances? How will we do it? Who do we listen to? So all of these different conversations are taking place, not in the COP itself, but actually throughout the year. In addition, there's something called the high-level dialogue on loss and damage, which hasn't happened yet. It looks like it's probably going to be around April of next year, although there may be some kind of a launch event at COP this year. And so again, where the humanitarians are engaging is really to try and talk about, first of all, how should the fund and the funding arrangements, so that's what's outside of the fund but goes to responding to loss and damage, how do they work together? What are some of the gaps? How do we ensure funds get to communities, countries that are being left behind? How do we ensure that funds can get to the local level? And again, building on what I think both Harriet and Jacobo said around the importance of the very local level of local voices and of local leadership in terms of implementation. Next stream of work is really around adaptation. And in particular, there is the UAE Bellum work plan, which is to develop the indicators for the global goal on adaptation. And that doesn't finish at this COP. It's an ongoing process. There have been submissions throughout the year, and it's actually trying right now, and this will finish in Brazil, to develop a set of indicators. And some of the areas where humanitarians have been coming together and seeking to engage in that process has been specifically around locally led adaptation. So this is actually the first time at the last COP that locally led adaptation was recognized as something of significance and value and hopefully to be tracked. And I would say this is part of the kind of quality of funding, not just quantity piece. So there's a lot of conversations around locally led adaptation and community-based adaptation, and then also around early warning, early action systems, because these are areas where the humanitarians have a lot of expertise and are seeking to support in developing indicators, and hopefully indicators also around improvement when it comes to human needs. As Jacobo mentioned, in particular, the NCQG is a major process where there's also been engagement. And from the humanitarian perspective, and I think this overlaps a lot with what Harriet was saying as well, looking not only at the volume and the adaptation gap, but some of the specific gaps, including fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So we're certainly seeing that if you look at adaptation finance and where it's going to, it's fragile and conflict-affected contexts that in particular are getting left behind, but there are also others that are being left behind. And so really wanting to identify who's being left behind and see what can be done about that has been a critical message for the humanitarian community. And then, and I think this was also raised by Jacobo, the piece around the NDCs. So the nationally determined contributions are meant to be put in place next year. The new ones are to be submitted early next year. And the whole idea is that these should be collectively meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement and effectively serving as roadmaps for action. And so again, this is a piece that's probably more relevant at the national level than at the global level, in terms of discussions with individual countries about their NDCs and also in terms of their NAPs. And maybe just one thing to flag is there have been a number of members of the group who have actually been at the national level engaging in the national adaptation plan development processes. One example I can share is that the Uganda Red Cross, they were actually facilitating civil society consultations in Uganda that helped to develop the Uganda National Adaptation Plan. So there's a lot of good examples of different organizations with expertise in humanitarian response and disaster risk management becoming engaged in these processes at the national level. So outside of the negotiated outcomes, there is the non-negotiated outcomes, which is the initiatives, the days, the themes. And we've already heard reference, Harriet mentioned the Relief, Recovery and Peace Declaration from last year, which I think was really significant from the humanitarian community because we finally got this very high level recognition that there were particular countries, communities, contexts that were being left behind and a commitment to do something about it. But I think the critical point now is that commitment's great. How do we see action on the ground in a way that benefits the most vulnerable? Similarly, with some of the other initiatives that were finalized last year, there was the Charter on Getting Ahead of Disasters. There was also a health declaration. So all of these now need to be implemented. And then in terms of the initiatives for this year, And I think I can look up and add to a link on the chat, I think, of the different initiatives that there are. This year, there are a number of relevance to the humanitarian community and to the peace community, including this idea of a peace declaration, of a peace hub. There's also been discussions around human security, human development, around water, agriculture, food. So there's a variety of different initiatives, urban initiatives. So there's a number of different initiatives that they've actually been shared at very top line form for consultation and that are going to be finalized at the COP itself. And so hopefully over the coming weeks, there will be some opportunities to engage and to influence those. And I know that talking to members of the presidency, it's taken a bit longer than they wanted, but they've now sent out to all the observers a letter with the information that they can then seek inputs on those. So they're not yet finalized, but they're seeking to build momentum. And some of these have some interesting entry points for humanitarians. Maybe a couple in terms of like how to get involved, because I think that was your question, wasn't it, Nishani? I think there's one important piece is really that involvement is both at a country level as well as at a global level and potentially also at a regional level. At the global level where we're coming together, I'd say if there are those who want to join the IASC climate group and our emailing list, do let us know. We're also developing a set of key messages at the moment that once they're developed, you're welcome to use, but I can also put a link in the chat to last year's key messages, which I think are still really valid. We'll be, when there are humanitarians who are present at COP, we'll be coordinating like we have in the past. We have a WhatsApp group to connect, to share events. The IASC has already reached out to all the members saying, share with us your events so we can get people to come, we can help to advertise them. It's also going to be a humanitarian hub again this year. So last year, OCHA was very successful in getting the UAE actually sponsored a humanitarian hub in the green zone. It was a really exciting place, some fantastic events, a good place for humanitarians to come together. However, it was in the green zone, so it was tricky to really engage with the negotiators. This year, they've managed to secure a space in the blue zone, which is the place where all of the negotiators are present, the governments are present. I think this is really positive. And they have opened their call for events. So again, I can put the form in the chat of how to apply to hold an event. You would need to have blue zone accreditation. And I know there have been issues around badges, which was flagged, I saw in the Mentimeter up at the beginning as one of the challenges of engagement. So fully recognize that. And yeah, there's probably some of the main kind of opportunities to connect with us and engage there. I hope that answered your questions, Nishani.
I'm hoping that it answered everyone else's questions too. Thanks so much, Kirsten. And there's so many opportunities, as you mentioned, and thanks for sharing the links to the humanitarian hub, the previous key messages. And we will also share with, in our event page, we will also share some of these information so that our organizations can also access this. We'll do a bit of a compilation of what all of you have been sharing today so that you can refer back in one place as well. And I'm now going to head to, because you mentioned a few things today on loss and damage, the communities who are most vulnerable, impacted, affected. And for us as humanitarians, obviously, human mobility is extremely crucial. So Alice, would you be able to share with us, where do you see some of the opportunities to discuss and promote human mobility issues at COP29, especially in relation to loss and damage? And kind of how can we as humanitarian actors contribute to this and advocate for some of these key messages coming out, etc. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Nishani, and happy to be here today. So thank you very much for the invitation. Maybe just to briefly introduce myself. So I'm Alice Bayer, and I'm indeed coordinating something called the Advisory Group on Climate Change and Human Mobility. This advisory group has actually been created in 2011, so it's now more than 10 years that we exist, and the group has actually been created within the UNFCCC, also as a response to the first mention of human mobility in a COP document in 2010 with the Cancun Agreement. So that's also a sign that actually human mobility issue is not really a new topic in the COP. I mean, it's actually an issue that is increasingly being discussed and visible, especially over the last years. And the advisory group has been created to really support parties with evidence, with technical support to better understand actually how human mobility and climate change are connected, and to provide the evidence that is needed to also inform action and support. And so we are composed of a very diverse group of actors. I mean, it goes from a lot of humanitarian organizations, actually, but also more development-oriented actors, and coming from the UN, but also a lot of NGOs, expert academia, and so on. So, as I said, actually, human mobility is indeed increasingly visible. I mean, I think now, and especially, for instance, last year at COP28, and also during the Glasgow dialogue over the last 2 years, it was really striking to see how human mobility is now consistently referred as one of the main illustration of loss and damage in the context of climate change, because that's also clearly one of the most visible impact of climate change on communities and on human lives. And actually, one of the relevance of human mobility in the UNFCCC has been particularly recognized in 2015, when the Paris Agreement has established something called the Task Force on Displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And that has really bring the issue of human mobility within the loss and damage work stream. And the task force is also composed of different experts, including IOM, UNHCR, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, IDMC, and others. And this task force over the last years has also really been instrumental to bring the issue into the work program on loss and damage, and to also identify policy and operational priorities to address it. And last year, before saying what to expect from COP29 and where it's going to be relevant to speak about human mobility at COP, I mean, last year, you might remember that human mobility was actually successfully integrated within the scope of the fund for responding to loss and damage, which was seen as really a significant achievement, because that clearly also opens the doors for funding activities and support parties to implement, especially developing countries, to implement activities to address displacement and to support the needs of displaced population. And also to mention that actually, as part of this COP outcome, from this COP document, it's important to mention that it refers both to displaced population, but also migrants and refugees. So it's quite a comprehensive also approach of human mobility spectrum, so encompassing both displaced like IDPs, but also refugees and migrants in vulnerable situations. And so, as it has been said actually before, and I think it's a very important point, I mean, COP is not the only moment where we discuss those issues. And since last year, actually, human mobility has continued to be discussed all over 2024, especially during the different meetings of the advisory board of the Santiago Network and as well as the board of the Loss and Damage Fund. And one of the key advocacy elements that was brought this year during this meeting was the need to ensure the participation of displaced population to the decisions related to the fund, and also the implementation of activities funded by the fund, and also to facilitate direct access of this displaced population to the fund. And I think that its advocacy point has been brought in this meeting this year and is going to remain very important at COP29. So I would say that in terms of opportunities, I mean, really advocating for the systematic inclusion and participation of affected communities to the decisions that affect their lives and their needs is going to be very critical for all the discussion around loss and damage. And so now more specifically on COP29, I mean, in terms of what are going to be the negotiation streams most relevant for human mobility, I mean, many of them have actually already been mentioned, because I think most of the organization like ours who advocate for the inclusion of human mobility, I mean, it's really just to make sure that those populations are not invisible in the negotiation and are included in, again, all the decisions that can affect them. So that relates to the work stream on loss and damage, but all the discussion around it. So it's about the Santiago network and making sure that the technical assistance that is going to be provided to the Santiago network also include technical assistance to support parties in addressing displacement. So making sure that the OB&E that the Santiago Network Secretariat has just opened the application for becoming a member of the Santiago Network, making sure that as part of OB&Es, there are organizations with expertise on displacement. But it's also about, of course, the loss and damage fund. So making sure and continuing to push for the inclusion and participation of displaced population. For instance, I mean, there is no proper UNFCCC constituency for migrants and displaced population at the difference of women, indigenous people, children. And actually, I mean, within this existing constituency, you have migrants and displaced population. I mean, we know that women are particularly affected and often represent the majority of displaced person. I mean, same for the indigenous people. But actually, as of today, there is no specific constituency to really bring the voice of those populations. So it's extremely important also to advocate to make sure that they are not forgotten in the conversation. It has been said already that the COP29 is going to be the COP about finance. So I'm not going to repeat that, just to reinforce that, yes, making sure that the NCQG integrate the sub-goal on loss and damage is going to be very critical because, yes, we have this loss and damage fund. Yes, it includes in the scope the displaced population. But we also know that as of now, the fund is almost empty. And so having this NCQG is going to be that recognize loss and damage and that push donor countries to commit also for funding on loss and damage is going to be critical to make sure that the fund is operational. So that's also a critical area in my mind. And just maybe a last one that has not been mentioned is that another thing that is going to be done at COP29 is a review actually of the Warsaw International Mechanism. As I said, the Task Force on Displacement is part of the Warsaw International Mechanism, so it's also going to be an important moment actually to review the work plan of the Warsaw International Mechanism and to make sure that human mobility continue to remain an important element of the work plan, to also renew the work plan of the TFD itself, and also to look at a better coherence. I think it's quite important. We now have this full architecture around loss and damage with the Santiago Network, the WIM, and the fund, but the articulation and the coherence between these three bodies still needs to be consolidated, and that's going to be also critical for what we are talking about. Just in terms of opportunities, to briefly say a word about that. I mean, there are opportunities for advocacy in relation to the different negotiation streams that have been just mentioned. But as Kirsten said, there is also the outside of the negotiation with everything that is happening in parallel. And at COP29, there will be 2 pavilions actually specifically dedicated to human mobility. I mean, there is one called the Climate Mobility Pavilion, led by the Global Center for Climate Mobility. And IOM will also have its own pavilion at COP29. So these two places are going to be also important to be there for those who are specifically interested in this issue. And just a last point, the advisory group, together with other initiatives, including the Climate Migration Displacement Platform, as well as the Loss and Damage Collaboration Working Group on Displacement, we are all working together on a set of joint messages on human mobility for COP29. And this document is really aims to be useful and practical to look at what can we say about human mobility for each of the key negotiation streams of COP29. It's a document that is also very open for endorsement by other organizations. So if there are some of you interested in endorsing the messages and even contributing to it, I'm also happy to share it with you, because we really believe that more this document will be endorsed, more impact it will have. Voilà, I might stop here, and if there's questions, happy to answer to it.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. And I mean, there's such an amount of rich information that has been shared today with the speakers. And before we head on to the Q&A, and we've got a few questions that have already come up, I'm going to head over to Natasha to share a little bit about what's happening on some of our Mentimeters. Over to you.
Thanks, Nishani. I'll just be brief here because we're about to move into the Q&A, and just to say there's been a really rich amount of content that we've just received from all of our speakers. I know I have many questions, and I can see that others do too. So if you have questions for any of our speakers, you can go back to the Mentimeter, and the link is in the chat, or use the code above, and you can add a question here. And we've got a number of questions already in, so thanks to those that have submitted. Nishani, why don't you take us away with actually jumping into some of these Q&A pieces?
Yes, definitely. Thanks so much for the questions. I mean, I've got a lot too, but let me just maybe focus on what we're getting from our participants today. I think one of the questions that came up, and a few things, is how much can NGOs actually influence the outcome? And this is something we get asked often with all these processes going on with parties to the conflict, with negotiators. And I think I'd pose that question to you, Jacobo, first. And if anyone else wants to jump in on the humanitarian side to give us a bit of that, ideas of how we as humanitarians are doing it. But what are some of your ideas and suggestions how we can actually influence? Over to you.
Well, let me first share a success story, particularly very relevant to the climate and humanitarian sector, which is the loss and damage. And having loss and damage, with all the caveats and the difficulties, this is a claim that started 35 years ago, okay, but some small island states, okay, I think it was the Solomon Islands, the first one that they talk about the loss and damage. It was no way to get it in the different agreements, no way the compensation thinking. I mean, it was not possible to get it into the under restoration thinking. It was not possible to include it under the Paris Agreement, okay? And due to the, I don't know if it is NGOs, civil society, I mean, this was taken back, okay, by NGOs, civil society, coalitions, it's been considered, a fund is being put in place. Of course, a lot of, the usefulness of the fund and the capacity of the fund to really change things, it needs to be proved. But I want to consider that is a success story. So this is what it's all about. And how did it happen? It happened in a process, particularly for loss and damage, that started, that revamped 2 years before Sharm el-Sheikh, 2 years before COP27, okay, with the COVID in there. But Glasgow, the previous COP, it was instrumental for it, and then all the year making a global campaign for it, it was quite important. Global campaign that obviously it like all the different campaigns, and this is the job for each of the organizations we work with, identifies where are the allies, identifies where are the obstacles, and obviously and you understand where the trades off and what the negotiations points are, okay? And the battle didn't only happen in Sharm el-Sheikh, of course, it happened obviously bringing consensus among an important amount of countries or parties before the actual agreement was done in Sharm el-Sheikh in the last minute, in the very last minute, actually, with extra time, because it was in the day after of the closure, so they needed to extend the closure 1 day more. So this is what it's all about. But of course, is tedious, is difficult. At the end of the day, we are talking about winning small battles in a I will say in a system that is basically creating this climate crisis and this humanitarian crisis, wars and disasters with a huge peaks of vulnerability. So of course, you know, probably what we are talking about is a much more radical that it needs to be done. But when we are talking particularly about influencing in this process, it is identifying clearly the topic, coming together with, I would say, a coalition, and it's a political action with campaigns, communication all together that needs to come in the push.
Kirsten, do you have any input on this for us as humanitarians? You know, how can we actually really influence, and where perhaps for us specifically?
Sure, and I think it's a great question. And I think there's a piece around the COP itself, and then there's in terms of where can you be, what can you do, who can you talk to, and then there's a piece around what it actually takes to change the outcomes. And I think that one of the points that Jacobo was flagging is that it takes a lot of time and a lot of people and a lot of organizations and a lot of coalitions to bring about change. And so I think that when there is, you know, one strong message that is being shared by a large number of organizations, and I think that the Loss and Damage Fund really, really shows this, that can be very impactful. And in that case, I think one of the strengths of the work that Can and others did was very much around civil society and governments coming together. I think the other piece to remember, of course, is that while all of us are observers, which means we have the privilege, if we can get a few badges and get people there, to actually be present in the blue zone. And I would really recommend not just being part of the events circus that's there with hundreds of events, where somebody said there are way too many events, how do you choose? Hundreds of events at the same time, but actually to be following the negotiations themselves. And so as an observer, you have a certain level of access to be able to listen to the negotiations. And really, if you're wanting to have any impact on those, I think it's important, A, to follow them the whole year through. It's not just a COP. And secondly, to actually have some really useful suggestions that can be shared directly with governments that you're partnering with and working with and have shared challenges. And so I think that where there's been huge success in seeing, you know, positive language coming through has been where there have been organizations often working with the governments in a given country. So national organizations working with their government saying, this is the problem we're seeing. It would be really useful to have a policy decision that does this. Could you include some of this kind of language? And so I think there's a really critical piece around the relationships with governments. And in particular, I would say at the national level. And some of those governments have invited different organizations to join their delegations as experts, generally not doing the negotiations, although some have been, but often to provide inputs and advice. So for example, as a humanitarian, if somebody shows you, we've got this language on disasters, we've got this language on early warning systems, does it make sense? And then we can actually play a really useful technical role of like, well, if you do this, this is what it means. And if you do this, this would be the impact. So I do believe that it really is possible to have an impact, be it from the outside in terms of changing the narrative, putting forward a goal, or quietly and engaging directly with governments, trying to support them to actually move the dial as well. But I think it is really important to try and work out, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to shift the narrative? Are you trying to change global opinion? Are you trying to change a specific text? And really, the bit that's going to have the biggest impact is going to be how these are implemented at the national level. Or I'd say the other piece is how the big funds are designed and how the money will flow are going to be some of the really critical pieces. But the short answer is yes, I think it is possible.
Thanks. And Harriet, do you have any input on that one? I'm using this particular question to also pick out your brains about other things that are coming in the Q&A and the chat, so that you can include some of those questions in there as well to answer. So Harriet, any input from the peace building sector that you're working on that can be collective, because we talked about coalition building, and Jacopo talked about coalitions. We talked about coalitions. How does that work in this particular COP and going towards COP30?
I think building a coalition is absolutely essential. If there's just one of you asking for something, it's obviously not going to happen. It's hard enough to have an impact as a coalition, as a network in itself. So I think that's a little bit of the foundation around which the Peace at COP community formed itself, so that we could be a group of organizations all calling for the same thing. And then I think Kirsten really framed it really well about how to engage. And yeah, I mean, never lose faith. I think it's always really important to say your piece, even if, yeah, I mean, the impact is always difficult to measure and is always very long term. But I think it's super important to, yeah, to be involved and to hold the decision makers that are there to account and to make them feel the pressure of civil society. I think that's also the role of observers at COP from the civil society perspective. So yeah, I think those would just be a couple of bits to add on to that.
Thanks. And Alice, we had some specific questions to you. There is no particular constituency for displacement, and this goes across for the humanitarian sector. There's no constituency representing the displaced communities, refugees, and people on the move. So what does that mean, and where is it that we as collective, so be it through CAN International, the peace building, the humanitarian sector, what are those key messages that we should be really taking forward, and in which space can you share very specifically what we can do? Because that's all our kind of prerogative or our responsibility to a certain extent. And I know that Sylvie also has mentioned in the chat that there are other constituencies like women, farmers who can also take that forward. There was another question on is you know, women, gender being really taken on board in the human mobility piece, and where is that? Over to you. Sorry, quite a few questions, but a quick response on that one. Thanks.
No, maybe just to respond to the one from Sylvie on the fund. I mean, indeed, as I said, there is no. I mean, I think there is currently 3 representatives of different constituencies that can attend the meeting of the board of the fund. I think there is women, indigenous people, and youth, maybe something. I'm not sure, but so that's it. So for instance, what we try to do is to exchange with these 3 constituencies to also make sure that when they are attending the board meetings, they can also raise some concerns from displaced communities and so on. So it's one way to go. I mean, it's to also go to use the other constituencies, because as I said, I mean, displaced population are across all of them. So it's also relevant for them to bring the challenges faced by this displaced population. And otherwise, I mean, I think our responsibility is just to make sure that this population, when they cannot be represented themselves by a proper constituency, can still have their voice heard and their interests defended by organizations like ours, when we are in a capacity as observers to attend the negotiation, to speak to parties. It's also our responsibility to make sure that their needs and their voice are listened and are included. So maybe that's a short answer. And still, I mean, I still hope that maybe one day we can also ask for a new constituency. I'm actually not familiar enough with the UNFCCC process to know how it can happen. But why not also pushing for a new constituency one day? That could be also.
Jacobo, is this something that's possible? You're on mute, I think.
Sorry for that. I'm saying yes, it should be possible. Of course, again, it's a matter of it's a matter of time. And you know what, I was also thinking as we were talking about opportunities, and I'm seeing on the chat the difficulties, and it was also on the initial, the difficulties to engage, you know, into COPs, and you know, by many of you in this one. And it's important to understand that there is multiple ways of engaging in COPs, and this is something that I always say. I'm talking from camp points of view, which we are, as I say, trying to represent or coordinate organizations on influencing on the text. COPs, let me just call it like this. Right now, there are, we like it or not, like a climate justice fairs, okay? And there is some areas of negotiations, but also, of course, many areas where there are different even business. There are different elements, but you know what are also important for influencing. Okay, I will say maybe it's difficult to access to a negotiator or to have access to text and be able to say, listen, there is a possibility of having a line there or whatever. It's okay if you can go for it, but if it's not that easy, there are other ways, for instance, to pay attention, you know, to bring negotiators to your events, to go into media. So what is important is to go with a previous and work out a strategy. Okay, so that's quite important to have it clear. Okay, so not all the work around climate policy is on just influencing the negotiators. Okay, so that also give us just to add, because I've been hearing this, but I think it's important that, and at the same time, it's important because I was listening to people, you know, the cost is important. Some countries are specifically costly. In every country, it happened from Scotland to Egypt. It's going to happen in Azerbaijan. Prices go up when 60, 70,000 delegates show up. Okay, so it's a matter of prices on everything goes up. So I understand that also the costs are there. So it's important also to do a cost benefit. Okay, in deciding how to go or how many people in your organization to go. Or that's quite important. Okay, so yeah, that's another element. Sorry for the practicalities, but this is something that I think is also important.
Well, there seems to be space to be able to include displaced mobile people on the move. Well, that might be something of a coalition to think about in the future. And I'm just now keeping in mind of our time. We're running almost at the end of our webinar, but before that, we have a few more things in line. Natasha, can I hand over to you?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to bring us back to our mentee for one more question. So we started off this webinar with a question about how you were thinking about engaging at COP this year. And we've learned a lot in the last hour and a half, about the different ways we can engage. And so we wanted to come back to this question to see whether, if at all, what our speakers have shared about the different key messages that you could be pushing forward as an organization, or the different pavilions you could be engaging in, or events that are happening in the lead up to COP and after COP, if that's changed in any way the way you're thinking about how you might engage. So we are back to Menti with this final question. The first is, yes, it's very clear how to engage at COP29. The second is, I have a greater sense of how I could engage at COP29, but I still have more questions. The third is, I'm still unclear on what my engagement will look like. And lastly, we still plan to not engage at all. And seeing some numbers come in, it's really exciting to see how many people are finding it very clear how to engage at COP. I hope this webinar was a contributor to that. At least there's still questions to be asked. And I think that for everyone and anyone that's engaged in COP and COP processes, there's always so many questions. It's a very complex mechanism and system and process. And as all of our speakers have said, it doesn't just happen at COP. So of course, there's still so many more questions. But glad to see that there's been some amount of clarity that's come out of this webinar, and there's still plenty more to come in terms of the work that we're doing as a Secretariat and we're doing as a humanitarian community in connection with the climate and peace communities as well, around how we might engage. And on that, I'll pass it back to Nishani to talk about our next steps.
Thanks, thanks, Natasha. As part of our follow-up from the webinar, and as I mentioned before, we will be sharing all the links, all the initiatives, the ways of engaging, opportunities, key messages, principles. And Jacobo, there was a question on where are your advocacy messages. So please do share with us that. We can also put that all together to share with you all of this. We'll also be looking at sharing a draft of a top-line statement for your red line comments for those signatories of the Charter Secretariat, which will be pulling in some of the key messages that we're hearing from you, from this webinar, and from this kind of the core collective action that we need to look for. we will be sharing information that's coming from the IASC group, as mentioned, and we hope to engage our signatories to share updates during COP29, which we will send you an email so that we can get your updates and input as well. And last but not least, we plan to share some of the messages we heard as well again on the webinar, but beyond that as well, because there's towards COP. So before that, I just kind of asked one quick round of what would you want to share as a final one-liner, key top line from our speakers to those who are still around on the webinar. Alice, you're on my set first.
Wow, it's always a difficult task to share one last messages. I don't know, but yeah, I don't know actually.
No worries. We move on.
I mean,
and then if
so
you
much, there is just so much. There is so much to say, and I just hope that people have heard and understood today that there is so many ways to engage. It's not only about going at COP. I mean, there is way more that can be done also beyond, or especially as I think it has not been said this year, but many organizations are quite facing challenges for being accredited at COP. So, I mean, I also encourage everyone to also explore how to be impactful and vocal, even without going at COP, and there are plenty of ways for that.
Perfect. Thanks. That was great. Harriet, you're next on my screen.
At least I had 3 more seconds with Alice, but I'll just say, yeah, I think never be afraid of engaging and always value the power of your own voice. So always just go for it, basically.
Thanks. Kirsten, you're next.
Sure. I would say, supporting what others have said, there was a question in the chat about understanding the COP agenda. And I did put a link further up to the presidency website, as well as their letters, which include, these are all the initiatives and these are all the themes. And so what I would encourage is, rather than trying to worry about the COP agenda itself, which is quite opaque, very long, often is discussed at the last moment, there has to be an approval in the first day of the formal agenda, which sometimes takes longer. At Bonn, it took a whole week to get the formal agenda approved. I would say focus much more on the issues that matter to you, the issues of what you are seeing in the country where you are working, and share those practical problems and recommendations of what could be done about them directly with governments and leaders who are going to be present, and to use all the tools in the toolbox, recognizing the climate processes are not the be-all and end-all to what will have an impact in country. It's how governments prioritize, it's how donors prioritize, it's around the priorities that are in the media, and it's around what you as an organization can and do. So I'd say it's all of those pieces come together, so don't underestimate each of their importance. Thanks.
Thanks, Kirsten. And last but not least, Jacobo.
Well, yeah, subscribing all what is being said, and on my side, allow me to zoom out a little bit, because I'm spent so many hours zooming into COP. So going back to and having the great opportunity of exchanging with all of you for the humanitarian community, I go back to what I started. I mean, at the end of the day, what is bringing here is an issue of rights, and an issue of justice, an issue of inequality. So of course, all the work zooming in. So let's not lose focus. Let's understand that there are different battles, but let's not lose the essence. Okay, at the end of the day, what we are talking is about structural change. Structural change, because the existing world is generating the crisis, is generating the wars, is generating the disasters that end up with loss of life and wealth, and it's generating the climate crisis. And it's all about being in the battles, but also understanding what's the structural change needed.
Thanks for pulling it back right to the beginning and right to the center of what's causing the problems and why we're having to have this sort of conversations and webinars. And Natasha, over to you to wrap up and for our final sharing. Thanks.
Thanks. And just to say thank you everyone that joined today. We shared earlier, you're welcome to stay in touch with us. There's various ways you can do that, including through signing up to our newsletter, which I just shared a link for in the chat. You can follow us on LinkedIn as well as on our website, where we're posting events and opportunities around not just COP, but broader work on climate and environmental action in the humanitarian space. And you can contact us anytime at our email, which is secretariat@climate-charter.org. And with that, just thank you again to all of our speakers and to everyone that joined today. It was really a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Nishani, can I say something, Nishani? Can I say something?